Hello guys, in this video we will look how to use interfaces and constructors. So now I just created a skeleton module to display this page, and this is the module. I named it as a interfaces, and then it has a controller as usual and views with the layout XML file and HTML file, the template, and also I used this time a view model and injected it in the layout, so I won't take too much of your time in building these, so you would know from previous videos. I would like to use the interfaces, the type of interfaces with Magento constructors and Magento classes. I will create interfaces and then implement them by classes and then inject them into new classes. So first of all, I will create a data interface. So this is API data, and then I will create interface and I call it supplier interface. So it's interface, supplier interface. It has two methods. One is to set code, block function set code, and one is to get code. Created this interface. Now I will need a supplier repository. This supplier repository is a service contract, so this is a data contract. Now I want a service contract to get me the supplier. So let's go ahead and create that. Supplier repository interface. The supplier repository interface will get me a new supplier. Now you pass a code into it and it returns a supplier interface or just a supplier. So this is the only thing I need in the supplier repository. Now I need to implement them into classes. So I'll create models, model supplier. Now it's a class supplier. Implements supplier interface. I need to implement the methods from the interface. I will have protected string code. Now in the set method, I will just have the code equals code. That's it. And in the get method, we just return the code. And that's it, we are done with the supplier. Now I will implement the supplier repository interface. This supplier repository interface, as we said, will return me a supplier. So I will go to the model, create supplier repository, implements the supplier repository interface, and I need to implement the method create new. To implement the method create new, I will need in the constructor to inject the supplier factory. So supplier interface factory, supplier factory. I don't like the interface word within it, so it's just supplier factory, and then initialize it. And now I will have supplier equals this supplier factory create supplier set code and return the supplier. So this will create me a supplier, set the code and return supplier. Of course the code is not set yet, we need to pass it from the create new method. Now we have done those. What we need to do is to pass this into the view model and then output the supplier code in the front page. So let's do that. I'll go to the view model. I will have a constructor, and the constructor will have supplier repository interface, supplier repository, then initialize it. And now what I'm going to say is public function get supplier code, and it will get me a string. Now return this supplier create new, passing the code abc123 and then get code. So when it creates a new, it will return a supplier and then get the code from the supplier. This will be set as the code of in the supplier object. Now we have this. I want to go to the HTML file. The view model is already injected here. It's already injected in the block, and now we have access to it in the template. Now I'll have a p tag, then this equals block get view model get supplier code. Now we have done that. We have a little problem now. The problem is there is no way in Magento to know what is this interface need to be replaced with, because when we say supplier repository interface, we mean the supplier repository class that need to be passed in, and it applies the same way on the supplier repository. When we say supplier interface factory, we want the supplier class to be passed in. Now we can do these from the dependency injection from the di file. So we will create di file and then m2 di, and what we need to do is the preference. The preference will tell whenever being asking for an interface, give an implementation for it. So we will be asking for the supplier repository interface. If we passed this interface into a constructor, then we need the implementer. The implementer will be the supplier repository, and this way we resolve the auto injection in Magento by the di file, which is through the preference node. Now we have done this. What we need next is another preference for the data contract. Now we have to copy the interface and paste it here, and then we will need to copy the class that implements the interface and paste it in the type here, and that's it. We are done. Now let's run the flush the cache flush config block HTML. Now we cleared the cache. If we refresh the page, so we are getting an error: impossible to process constructor arguments, training supplier interface factory, training interfaces model supplier interface factory. So the interface factory, if we go here, this one, we need to import it because it's not imported. Now hopefully if we refresh, we get corrected, and now we have in the code displayed to us here, and this comes from the repository, from the supplier repository, and then passed into the view model, and from a view model to the template. Now this is one of the ways of having the interfaces to be injected into the Magento classes. There is another type of interfaces that needs to be injected as well. They are not mapped through the di file as preferences. So let's have a knowledge of those. So this is the first bit of the interfaces. These are the API contracts, which is the service contract and the data contract, and they are always bound, these classes always bound to one interface, and one interface only created for one class only. And in this way you can create an interface for them. However, if you have an interface and can be implemented by multiple classes, you cannot create a preference for them, because you might inject different classes instead of the interface. Let's have an example of this one. So in the model, I will have an interface code validation interface, and then space training interfaces. So it's interface code validation interface, and we'll have a method called validate, and then we pass the string code in it, and it returns void. It doesn't return anything. It just, if the code is not valid, then it will throw an exception. Now we have this. I will create another class here, and I'll call it code length validation. And this code length validation implements the code validation interface, and will also implement the validate method. And what we need to check here, if strlen, if the string length of the code is greater than 9, then we would throw an exception. Throw invalid argument exception. Invalid argument exception code must not be more than 9 characters. That's it. So this is the implementation of this class. So this is one implementation. Probably you would like another class to have it here, like code is numeric validation, code alphabetic validation, code special characters validation, and then all those validation classes will implement the code validation, and it doesn't make any sense to have them as a reference in here, because the class will be implemented by many classes. The interface will be implemented by many classes. But if the interface implemented by one class only, and this one class only has this interface created for it only, so they have in this relationship and they don't have any other relationship outside of this, so this interface is only implemented by one class, and this one class is only implementation of this interface, then you will have a reference. If you have an interface and could be implemented by many classes, it won't make sense to have it as a preference. You don't need to make it as a preference, but you will need to use it as a injection, as we are going to explain in the example here. So I will go to the repository, and in the repository, supplier repository, I will have code validation interface, code validation, and now just initialize it. And here, before I create the supplier, I will validate the code before creating the supplier. If the validation pass, then create the supplier. If not, fails at this line. Now we have injected this. If we run the page, we will get an error. So training interface model code validation interface, it doesn't know which implementer. It cannot instantiate interface because interfaces are not instantiated. Magento needs to know what class is of type this code validation interface to be injected instead. So the way we do this, we will go to the di. We also use the di file for it. Now I will have the type. The type is the supplier repository interface. You can use the class or interface. I would prefer the interface. And then arguments. In the argument we have code validation, and this is relative to this name but without the $sign. And what we need to do is inject the code length validation here. So we will inject this as a concrete class as a replacement for the interface, and also this needs to be as a object. We need to clear cache again, and now let's refresh, and basically it's working. But to prove it is working, and we'll validate, if we go to the supplier repository, not in the supplier repository, in the view model, and in the view model, so we have 3, 3, 6, 7. If we put like 4, 6, 4, 5, 6, I think this will throw the exception because this will be greater than 9. Code must not be more than 9 characters. But if we remove 1, probably this is it. This is 9, and this is working. So this is it, and I think that's the end of the tutorial. If you like the video, please subscribe, and I'll see you in next video.